Good morning, everyone. I think most of you know me, but I'm Cindy Arnson, the director of the Latin American program here. It is a pleasure to welcome you to this very important discussion about Nicaragua, which often gets overshadowed by a related crisis in Venezuela, which is not too far away. Even for those of us who have been critical of the anti-democratic practices of the Nicaraguan government of President Daniel Ortega, what has taken place over the last 11 months, I think, is truly astonishing. Mass protests, as you know, erupted in April of 2018 over a variety of pent-up grievances. These protests were met with violent repression led by the Nicaraguan police, with the participation of paramilitary groups and members of Sandinista mobs. The security forces and snipers opened fire with live ammunition against unarmed demonstrators. These civilians constituted the majority of the 325 people that the Inter-American Commission for Human Rights of the OAS have documented were killed in the short span of about 6 months. The government, led by Ortega and his wife, the vice president, Rosario Murillo, has jailed close to 800 of its opponents in the last year. Credible reports of the torture of political prisoners abound, documented by OAS bodies and chronicled in the recently released human rights report of the State Department, among the reports of other non-governmental organizations. Demonstrations have been outlawed since last fall. Independent media have been harassed and threatened, and prominent journalists, including many friends of the Wilson Center, are among the thousands who have been forced to flee into exile. There have been a number of attempts at dialogue, first aimed at the departure of the Ortega government, also aimed at moving up the elections scheduled for 2021. These are between representatives of the Ortega government and the opposition umbrella group known as the Civic Alliance. But talks, which began again with a note of hope in February, have been suspended yet again over unmet demands that the government release hundreds, not 50, but hundreds of political prisoners that are currently in detention. So this is the broad context for today's discussion of the Nicaraguan economy and the way that the country's precipitous economic decline over the last year might perhaps provide an incentive for a peaceful resolution of the Nicaraguan crisis. We're extremely pleased to welcome back to the Wilson Center Professor Richard Feinberg, distinguished economist, a former public policy scholar here, and a member of our program's advisory board, to present his commissioned paper on the Nicaraguan economy and the relationship between the economic fundamentals and the fundamentals of democratic governance. We're also pleased to have his co-author, Beatriz Miranda, who is with us and has been working assiduously on the Spanish translation of this document. There are hard copies, and this is on our website, so please grab a copy before you leave. We're also pleased to welcome our other two distinguished panelists, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, Julie Chung, who has recently joined the Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs, and Nicaraguan private sector leader Luis Rivas, who will offer their perspectives, respectively, on U.S. policy and the role of the private sector in the search for a political settlement in Nicaragua. Before turning the podium over to my friend and colleague Eric Olson, a consultant to the Latin American program and the Washington director of the Seattle International Foundation, I'd like to express my special thanks to Jacqueline Dolezal. Here in the back, this is, I think, her last event with us at the Wilson Center before she takes up a position at the Inter-American Foundation. Also, Madeline Medrano, who was helping to sign people in downstairs. Catalina Casas here with the camera for their expert assistance in preparing for today's seminar. Thank you.
Thank you, Cindy, and I'm delighted to be here to share this stage with such distinguished guests, and to focus again on the difficulties, the challenges, the problems that Nicaragua faces. As Cindy has said, we have focused primarily to date on many of the democratic issues, the erosion and faltering and demise of democratic tradition in Nicaragua over the last several years. But now we want to focus a little bit more on the economy and how it has been affected by the closure of democratic space. Our panel today will look a little more slightly differently at Nicaragua through the lens of economic performance over the last 2.5 decades and how the closing of democratic space contributed to the current economic turmoil the country is facing. Not only has economic performance suffered, the currency been weakened and foreign investment slowed, but the Nicaraguan people are suffering the dual tragedies of repression and increasing economic despair. As Cindy mentioned, we're going to start our panel this morning with a presentation by Professor Richard Feinberg, who's been a very close friend to the Latin America program here at the Wilson Center as a fellow and as a member of our advisory board. And we commissioned him and his partner in crime here, Beatriz Miranda, to conduct this study that Cindy mentioned, Nicaraguan Tragedy from Consensus to Coercion, that examines the trajectory of Nicaragua's economy and looks at how consensus on sound economic policy was finally undone by an increasingly authoritarian government. Let me just quote from the report briefly, as Richard and Beatriz wrote. While the combination of private economies and autocratic politics may thrive in some Asian societies, there is not yet a successful and enduring example in the Western Hemisphere, and Nicaragua is unlikely to prove an exception to the rule. Probably a little understated even, but thank you. I thought it was a great line. We have full bios for our speakers in the back and online, but let me just briefly introduce folks again. Richard Feinberg, as we said, is professor of international political economy at the Graduate School of International Relations and Pacific Studies at the University of California, San Diego. He was also a non-resident senior fellow of foreign policy at the Latin America Initiative at Brookings Institution, and he served in several senior positions in the administration with President Clinton, as senior director for the National Security Council's Office of Inter-American Affairs. So thank you, Richard, and we'll hear from him first, and then we'll turn next to Julie Chung. I'll introduce everybody so we can move on after that. Julie Chung is Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs at the Department of State. She was previously director for Japan in the Bureau of East Asian and Pacific Affairs. In Colombia, she served as Deputy Political Counselor, where she managed the U.S. government's largest extradition program, including paramilitary and narco-trafficking cases. And then after Ms. Chung, we will hear from Luis Rivas. Luis Rivas is Chief Operating Officer of ProAmerica Financial Corporation, a commercial banks network with operations in Central America, Panama, Dominican Republic, and Ecuador. Previously, Mr. Rivas held the position of Chief Executive Officer at Banpro, at the subsidiary of ProAmerica in Nicaragua. Prior to his career in banking, Mr. Rivas worked as an economic advisor to the Nicaraguan government from 2002 to 2003. So we have a very well-informed and distinguished panel, and look forward to the presentations, the comments, and we'll have time at the end for some questions from the audience. So Richard, the floor is yours. You're welcome to come up here, especially you have a presentation. So.
Thank you very much, Cindy, Eric. It's always a pleasure to be back here at the Wilson Center. I see a lot of friends in the audience. Thanks for being with us. Juan Cruz, David Lewis, Robin Rosenberg, old buddies of mine through many policy battles over the years here in Washington. I'm very pleased to be with such a distinguished panel. Luis Rivas, in Managua, he has the reputation of being the sharpest financial analyst in town. Right, Luis? And Julie Chung, of course, has had a very distinguished career as a diplomat in the State Department. But most importantly, she is a graduate of the University of California, San Diego. All right. Thank you. Thank you for that. Yeah. So I'm here to tell, actually, a very inspiring story, but also a very tragic story of Nicaragua in the last 25 years. Since the restoration of multi-party democracy in 1990, over these last 3 decades, Nicaragua has had really quite successful economic and social policies. If you travel around Nicaragua with some historical perspective, you can see visibly the improvement in living conditions of the average Nicaraguan family. Demonstrably superior economic and social performance as compared to the northern tier. And the northern tier, the tragedy of the faltering of economic and social development in Guatemala, particularly Guatemala, Honduras, and to a degree in El Salvador, explains, of course, the migrant crisis that we're so aware of here in the United States. We have not had that sort of huge spillover so far out of Nicaragua because of relatively successful economic and social policies. I should emphasize that the faltering of the economies in the northern tier is not for the lack of effort by the international community, which has poured billions into those countries. Rather, the root causes lie in Guatemala City and Tegucigalpa. That is to say, the faltering of their own governments. That has not been the case in Nicaragua. Nicaragua's uplifting story in the economic and social area is told in the visuals in the report, which we'll run through here. And I, again, have to thank Beatriz Miranda for doing all the hard work in that regard. So notice the slope, upward sloping, right? This is GDP per capita. As I say, the average income by the average Nicaraguan and Nicaraguan household has risen steadily over the last 35 years from 1994, or 25 years. And that was driven largely by an export-oriented economy. It's a very positive, uplifting story. Yes, of course, Nicaragua started from a low base, a very low base. And so, as the paper emphasizes, if you want to compare Nicaragua to Sweden or to Singapore, okay, it doesn't compare very favorably. And here I have to say I have to correct my good friends at the Inter-American Dialogue, their most recent publication called Unfulfilled Promises, Latin America Today. That publication falls into that same trap of comparing Latin American performances to the imagined utopias of, like Sweden and Singapore. Those comparisons, which we hear too often in analyses, inevitably are a recipe for disappointment and frustration. Rather, what we try to do in our paper is begin with the reality of Nicaragua itself, Nicaragua's own history, Nicaragua's own performance. And based upon that as a benchmark, we see progress over the last 25 years. The paper underscores the fact that there's been continuity in policies in Nicaragua over the last 25 years. That is to say, continuity between the neoliberalism of the 1990s and the leftism of the Sandinistas since 2007. That is to say, leave aside the hot rhetoric, which would lead you to think that these are dramatically different policies, and actually you'll find continuity in economic policies. That is to say, essentially market-oriented, open economic policies that have benefited the large majority of Nicaraguans. The Sandinistas, and we have, I think, representatives here from the IMF, the Sandinistas remained within IMF guidelines. The Sandinistas remained within the free trade CAFTA Accord, signed in 2005 by the Nicaraguan legislature, where the Sandinistas had a substantial presence, and they did not oppose it. And most importantly, as I'll emphasize, throughout this 25-year period, good, fluid relations between the private sector and the public sector in Nicaragua. Nicaragua is a small, necessarily very open economy. living within international norms. Even as, and there are a number of distinguished Nicaraguans with us today, even as, paraphrasing Nicaragua's outstanding poet, Rubén Darío, the smaller the country, the bigger the dreams. Nicaragua. So, as we see from the slides here, very good growth. But before we go on to the numbers, here is the cover of our publication. And as a professor, I like to ask the audience, the students here, what do you see? What's the import of this photograph? Anybody care to respond?
The store is closed.
Well, okay. Not the answer I was looking for, but a good one. So if you can read it, it's obviously a campaign poster. Rosario Murillo, the vice presidential candidate, Daniel Ortega, the presidential candidate, their basic slogan, Christian, socialist, and solidarity. Flying over the Nicaraguan Institute of Culture, that is to say, a government building. So what this intends to show is how the Sandinistas gradually dissolved the differences between party and state. And that is what led to the current crisis. That's the message of that colorful photograph, okay? And that is what ultimately led to the tragedy of last April and May. Nicaragua is a very diversified economy. A big problem we often see in developing countries is that they'll have one or two exports. Hello. And those exports, if the prices go up and down, the economies are hit, and they can have very volatile performance. Nicaragua, despite its small size, has had an increasingly diversified export platform. So Nicaragua remains largely an agricultural society, right? The majority of Nicaraguans still live in rural areas or in small towns, but it's a diversified base on the agricultural side, coffee, livestock, various other products, sugar, peanuts, tobacco. And in recent years, the economy has added, also the manufactured exports actually are largely agro-industry. So sugar, rum, which we all enjoy, right? Tobacco, puros, etc. Here we have Nicaraguan men and women rolling premium cigars. Some say Nicaragua, right, Luis, produces the best cigars in the world, right?
Among the best.
Among the best. Well, I, as an aficionado of cigars, will say the best, okay? Luis is properly modest about his own nation. In addition to agricultural exports, though, Nicaragua built up a free trade zone over the last 25 years. This is very much linked to CAFTA, and the Sandinistas kept this going. In fact, you can see under the Sandinistas a significant increase in number of employees, exports, value added. Some people say, oh, these are sweatshops. Actually, the workers in the free trade zone are protected by the Better Work program, which is a program of the International Labor Organization, the ILO, combined with the IFC, the World Bank. And in addition to that, the workers in these free trade zone areas, a lot of it is textiles and apparel, are protected by global brands who require compliance with international labor standards. As Nicaragua gained a reputation for stability, low crime, and natural beauty, international tourism gradually took off. And that's another foreign exchange earner. The tourism in Nicaragua, so far at least, is modeled on the Costa Rican example, not on Cancun and Varadero, but rather of mostly family-owned, small-scale boutique hotels and casual, healthy living. You can see all this in the report. Everything's going up, more tourists, more income. San Juan del Sur. Here's my advertisement for Nicaragua tourism. Particularly from California, all the young folks go down there and enjoy the sun and the surf. So, Nicaragua export earnings diversified among agriculture, agro-exports, light manufacturers and free trade zones, international tourism, and remittances. Nicaraguan families basically have a strategy. They send one or two of their members overseas to earn income and send back remittances. That's a smart family strategy. Something like 10% of Nicaragua GDP is now accounted for by wages sent back by family members working overseas. In addition to that, foreign capital increasingly has flowed into Nicaragua. Foreign direct investment coming from a diverse variety of sources, not mainly the United States, actually, but coming from Asia, from Mexico, from other Central American countries, and to some degree from Europe as well. This foreign investment went into key productive sectors: telecommunications, energy, tourism, commerce, and finance. In addition, foreign capital flowed in from the international financial institutions. The IFIs, if you read their reports up until this last year, the IFIs were in love with Nicaragua, glowing reports about Nicaraguan economic and social performance. Remittances. Here we see that although the bilaterals, green line, bilaterals gradually became disenchanted with Nicaragua in reaction largely to the politics of the Sandinistas. A lot of the Europeans did not like the anti-abortion laws. They didn't like the repression of non-governmental organizations, and they gradually dropped out. But the multilaterals, the blue line, up to $600 million in flows here, we're talking flows, not commitments, in 2017, led in large measure by the Inter-American Development Bank, but also the World Bank and some regional development banks. Venezuela was very important. This line here, lots of money flowing in during the boom years of high oil prices and the Chavistas and President Chavez, but with the combination of Chavista, the passing of Chavez himself, and then the collapse of oil prices, we can see that by 2017, Venezuelan money had essentially stopped flowing, but it had been replaced in large part by the IFIs, particularly by the Inter-American Development Bank. During these good years, prosperity was broadly shared, as measured, for example, by Gini coefficients. The Gini coefficient fell from 0.49 in 2005 to 0.466 in 2014. Those of you who are familiar with Gini coefficients, lower is better. So things were moving in the right direction from a reasonably, relatively speaking, equal distribution of income compared to other countries in the region. More importantly than that, I would say, social indicators were constantly improving, whichever indicator you want to look at. We're talking about healthcare availability, longevity, maternity care, infant mortality, access to water, access to education, all of those social indicators improving in Nicaragua during all of these years. Also, rising employment in the formal sector. Employment increased as workers transited from the informal sector to more modern formal sector where they are protected with Social Security and other benefits. Real wages, however, I know maybe this graph's a little confusing, but the basic story is real wages improved a little, but not that much. And although it may sound harsh to say, that enabled Nicaragua to remain competitive with regard to attracting foreign investment and exports, particularly in the free trade zone. Wages improved actually a little more in the years of the so-called neoliberal regimes as compared to the Sandinista period. Are we surprised? Is that a surprise, folks? Forget the rhetoric, look at the numbers. You'll see that the workers did just as well, if not slightly better, actually, under the neoliberal regime as compared to the Sandinistas. And this is based upon government numbers. Throughout these 30 years, the Nicaraguan economy benefited from a fluid dialogue between the public and private sectors, and perhaps Luis will address this theme. Nicaragua, after all, is a small economy, a small society. Everyone knows everybody, except for maybe some of the Sandinistas who are less well integrated into social networks. But under Daniel Ortega, up until recently, there was a very fluid dialogue between public and private sectors, and this dialogue, they vetted all major economic initiatives, fiscal, regulatory, before the initiative would actually go for formal approval through the Congress. For a moment in time, Nicaragua had overcome what arguably has been the main obstacle to sustained economic and social growth throughout Central America. And that main obstacle is that the public and private sectors can just not get along. They are endlessly arguing in bitter disputes among themselves. The result of that is discontinuity in policy, lack of confidence, short-termism, and lack of progress in general. That problem of lack of good dialogue between public and private sector for a moment in time had been overcome in Nicaragua. Tragically, however, the government of Ortega and Murillo began to violate democratic norms, plowing an increasingly unlevel playing field. This is all very well documented in some of the reports that Cindy emphasized. Increasingly electoral fraud, disenfranchising political parties and prominent opponents, making life very difficult for critical media and NGOs. And as my first photo showed, blurring the lines between party and state. And, as we saw most recently, politicizing the security apparatus. All of which was such a pity, because in many ways, we have to recognize the Sandinistas delivered good government. Their ability to move funds from the IFIs, to move investments, to solve a lot of the social and economic problems was documented. So the tragedy is a double tragedy: economic and social success, but political overreach. So that eventually, the public and private sector dialogue broke down. The rise and fall of Venezuelan largesse is worth just a quick message. Perhaps that was a causal factor, because when the money was flowing, as we saw on the table, the government could satisfy many constituencies at once. With Venezuelan budget support, the government could fund social programs without raising contentious taxes. But when the Venezuela fiesta came abruptly to a crashing halt, the choices became more difficult. This past April, the spark was the government announcement of a reform of the pension system, a reform that was absolutely necessary. The IFIs had been warning for years that the pension system was running out of liquidity. The way the government acted, the way they implemented that reform without adequate discussion, without adequate consensus, that is what was the spark for the social explosion. When the first protest occurred and there was some initial shooting by the government, rather than immediately returning to negotiations, rather than diffusing the crisis, as Ortega had shown his ability to do in previous years, rather than do that, El Carmen, which is where the Ortega family holed up in this very secure, secretive compound, El Carmen chose to repress the insurrection with deadly force, as Cindy explained. We have to recognize the repression did give the government time. It gave the government some space in the political sphere. But the economy immediately began to contract. Not the result of some conspiracy, not the result of some complot. Rather, each market's actor, households, investors, financial institutions, protecting their own interests, began to restrict their activities. And here we see in this dramatic graph how an economy, when it suffers a severe political shock, can rapidly enter into a tailspin. There's an initial shock to confidence. People hold their money. They stop consuming. Business stops investing. Business cuts back on its investment. It lays off workers. Of course, tourists stop coming. The banks react themselves in front of a situation of uncertainty and deposits flowing out. The banks then, seeing a less secure environment, and in order to protect their own solvency and liquidity, begin to cut back on lending. Luis will go into more detail, I'm sure, and the economy goes into a tailspin. Before the crisis, there were construction cranes everywhere throughout Managua and in major cities. Suddenly, all of that came to a dramatic halt. So Nicaragua now is at a turning point. Government capacities can catch up to economic performance. Governments can construct a well-functioning model of open democratic capitalism with social inclusion. building on the economic successes of the past 3 decades, or at this turning point, tragically, the country could regress into the dark abyss of political repression and economic misery. Beatrice and I conclude our paper, that shows with this graph, 3 possible futures of Nicaragua in numbers. If Nicaragua is unable to find a political solution, the red line, continual decline in per capita income out to 2050. If Nicaragua is able to put the pieces back together again, it should be able to resume growth if it continues to grow at about 5% as it had, or about 3.5% on a per capita basis as it has in the past. This would be per capita income, so in a household of 4, you'd be up to about 25,000, not too bad by 2050. If Nicaragua can really get its act together, solve its political conflicts, and address some of the, let's say, structural obstacles to economic growth, we could see a much more prosperous Nicaragua going forward. Which of those 3 paths the Nicaraguans will choose remains to be seen. One can put together historical arguments suggesting all 3 of those scenarios. We're fortunate to have Julie Chung with us to discuss U.S. policy. I will only point out that up till now, I think there's been a remarkable bipartisan consensus here in Washington that the United States should employ its economic levers to induce the government in Managua to negotiate a peaceful democratic outcome to at least get Nicaragua back to that blue line. The international community, all of us, we can supply the right incentives, but ultimately it will be up to the Nicaraguans to decide their own history. Thank you very much. Look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Richard, and congratulations on the paper once again, and Beatrice, too. Sorry. So now we'll turn to Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary Julie Chung, who will talk about U.S. policy towards Nicaragua. Thank you, Julie. It's up to you, whatever you feel comfortable with.
I don't have a fancy presentation, but I really want to thank the Woodrow Wilson Center for welcoming me here today, and for Richard and Beatrice for the excellent report. This is the quote that I was going to use, and it's one of the same ones that Richard just cited in this excellent report. But Nicaragua is at a turning point. Governance capacities can catch up to economic performance to construct a model of open, democratic capitalism with social inclusion. Alternatively, the country can regress into the dark abyss of political repression and economic misery. I think that really captures the choices that are upon Nicaragua, its government, and its people. So I'd like to talk to you today about the State Department's point of view and how we see the situation on the ground. The unfolding Nicaraguan crisis did not begin in April 2018. It's been a process through years and decades of subtle, slow, creeping authoritarianism and gradual dismantling of democratic institutions. It's also the result of what seemed to be a convenient arrangement between the Ortega regime and particular business and political elements under the infamous Pacto, which may have created a veneer of stability for some time, but was not sustainable. And I think the Nicaraguan people and civil society really understand that these arrangements and what they have wrought upon their country, and they're not going to accept a return to the status quo. As we know, the Ortega regime controls all branches of government, including the electoral machinery, removing all checks and balances. Successive municipal, regional, and national elections have all been neither free nor fair, marred by irregularities, lack of transparency, and with the Sandinista party controlling all electoral institutions. So credible international observation efforts have also been weakened by a lack of complete access to assess pre-electoral processes, meaning citizen faith and ballot secrecy is really non-existent. The government's previous model of dialogue and consensus with the private sector was a mechanism that supplanted and co-opted democratic and legislative channels. Again, while it may have been a simplified short-term solution, we don't believe that was a sustainable solution. And the Nicaraguan people deserve better. We see the consequences today. Uncertainty and massive economic decline replaced the country's shallow stability overnight when the regime chose repression and violence over human rights and the democratic yearnings of the Nicaraguan people. Now, I had the privilege of visiting Nicaragua in January of this year with Senior Advisor to the Secretary, Ambassador Mike McKinley. And our purpose in traveling was to emphasize the United States' continued support for the efforts to seek a peaceful resolution to the crisis, a return to democracy, and the full protection of human rights. We met with a diverse group of Nicaraguans, including representatives of the Catholic Church, private sector, civil society, civic alliance, and human rights defenders. I was touched by the stories of terrible suffering and intimidation that many have endured, especially since April 2018. I heard of arbitrary detentions, state-sanctioned violence, human rights abuses, violations, and our human rights report, as you referenced last week, documents these and other examples of the rapid deterioration of human rights in the country. And the monitoring efforts of the Independent Inter-American Commission on Human Rights over the past year only reaffirm a worsening of the situation. What's clear now, the situation in Nicaragua is a tragedy with the direct regional consequences. And we see many have been forced to flee to other countries in the region, and the Ortega government continues to institute a policy of what it calls exile, jail, or death for anyone perceived as opposition. I really applaud the dedication and resolve of those Nicaraguans who have undertaken the difficult work to help the country find its way back to the rule of law and democracy. Their courage and resilience in the face of attacks are inspiring. And I met some students here today, this morning, from Nicaragua, who are continuing that fight. Now, during the visit, we also met with government officials, including President Ortega, and our message was clear. Attacks and threats against peaceful protesters and the general population violate the human rights of the Nicaraguan people, and they are unacceptable. They must cease. Let me be also clear about another point. The crisis in Nicaragua is not just an economic crisis by accident. It's a political one. It's caused by the gradual dismantling of the rule of law and public institutions over a long period of time. This is what many have likened to a slow-moving coup against democratic norms and constitutional order. So early, free, fair elections, full respect for human rights, and restoration of truly independent democratic institutions, that's the only viable path back to democracy and sustainable economic development in the country. The United States is working with countries throughout the world to support an international approach to help the Nicaraguan people find a peaceful, democratic, and comprehensive solution to the current crisis. President Ortega is attempting to frame this conflict as an ideological struggle between Nicaragua and the United States. That's absurd. Daniel Ortega's conflict is with the Nicaraguan people and their desire to live in democracy and freedom. It's as simple as that. The expulsions of respected international human rights monitoring bodies in August and December of last year made clear that the Ortega regime seeks to avoid any international scrutiny of its actions. Coordinated international action is key to increasing the pressure on President Ortega and his supporters to reach a negotiated solution to the ongoing crisis. To this end, we are working with other concerned OAS member states through the OAS Working Group on Nicaragua, which monitors the situation and promotes dialogue and democracy. And we really want to thank Canada and Chile for their efforts in advancing the mandate of this working group. The OAS General Secretariat, working in representation of Secretary General Luis Almagro, has sent 2 delegations to Nicaragua in the past month, and we strongly support their proposals, calling for the release of political prisoners and the need for comprehensive electoral reform. Credible and unbiased observation of any future elections will also prove important. The United States has taken action to promote accountability of corrupt and complicit Nicaraguan officials. We have sanctioned 6 Nicaraguan officials for their role in serious human rights abuses, undermining democratic processes, institutions, and committing corruption. Those names are And I want to call them out: Roberto Rivas, Francisco Diaz, Fidel Moreno, Francisco Lopez, Rosario Murillo, and Nestor Moncada Lao. By taking these actions, the U.S. government has prevented key officials within the Ortega regime from using the U.S. financial system to exploit the people and the public resources of the Nicaraguan people for their private gain. Our sanctions stand as a ready framework and pressure measure that we can continue to use for this purpose. We've also revoked visas and implemented visa restrictions for individuals involved in the repression of peaceful protesters. We've restricted individuals for invitations to the government of Nicaragua for U.S.-led international events and discouraged financing of the oppressive regime by international financial institutions. In December, President Trump signed the Nicaragua Human Rights and Anti-Corruption Act of 2018, the NICA Act, signaling his further commitment to promoting democracy, human rights, and the rule of law in Nicaragua. And we gained widespread bipartisan support for this. We also support Nicaraguan civil society in documenting human rights violation and calling for greater accountability of the regime in the international and regional fora. So where are we today? The Ortega regime's detention of protesters Saturday, just a few days ago, go against the claims that they are credibly participating in a current dialogue process. Nicaraguans, the United States, and the international community need to see concrete actions now. And you must have all seen the statement by the State Department yesterday when we call for the immediate release of individuals arrested for simply expressing their opposition peacefully to the Ortega regime. House arrest for some of those arbitrarily detained is not enough. Media representatives must be allowed to operate freely in Nicaragua, and their strong, independent voices are vital as Nicaraguans undertake dialogue to restore democracy, rule of law, and respect for human rights. The United States will not be satisfied until the rights of all those in Nicaragua are fully restored, including the rights of citizens to vote at genuine periodic elections and the right to express themselves freely and openly. And there is accountability of those who committed human rights violations and abuses. The ultimate resolution lies with Nicaraguans. The United States strongly supports all of these efforts to develop a national dialogue to resolve the crisis that will lead to early, free, and fair elections. But while the United States and the international community do have a role to play, a lasting solution to the crisis can only be achieved by political action that involves all the stakeholders in Nicaraguan society. So we will commit once again that the United States will continue to use all of our economic and diplomatic means at our disposal to support the Nicaraguan people's calls for a restoration of democracy through early, genuinely free and fair elections. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, now we will hear from Luis Rivas, the Chief Operating Officer of ProAmerica Financial Corporation. Thank you, Luis.
Thanks. First of all, I would like to thank Cindy and Eric for inviting me to the Wilson Center. You guys make an extraordinary effort to focus on key events that take place in South and Central America that bring relevance and insight into the main challenges of the region. Secondly, I would like to congratulate Richard and Beatriz on what I believe to be an excellent research paper, which in a very elegant but simple way puts into perspective the recent economic, political, and social realities of Nicaragua. A country that by the late 70s had enjoyed years of enormous economic success, but that also saw its institutions substantially eroded by the political ambitions of a regime that at the time wanted to remain in power at all cost, which eventually led to a civil war that put into place a socialist government that threw the economy back to its 1940s level. And that's why Richard rightfully said Nicaragua in 1994 began from a very low indicators on GDP and GDP growth and GDP per capita. A level of poverty that provoked one of the largest migration of Nicaraguans abroad. My family and I suffered that calamity with no relations whatsoever with the Somoza regime at the time. We were politically persecuted, our property confiscated, and forced into exile to the United States. I understand the situation of young people today in Nicaragua. I was 17 when I came to the United States, and I am grateful to the US that received me and allowed me to continue my studies and to reach a professional life. While reading Richard and Beatrice's paper, it is difficult not to identify many similarities between then and now, and how after only 30 years, we are facing similar challenges, as well as the possibility of solving the current challenges in a very different way than in the 70s. What are the odds? While reading the paper, I could not stop thinking about the name of the movie directed by Robert Zemeckis, Back to the Future. In any event, 2.5 months into 2019, not to repeat what Richard has said about the trends in the economy, the economic variables continue to the trend explained in the paper. The financial system continues to contract, and the economy indicators continue to deteriorate. This situation is coupled by clumsy economic policy, mainly contractionary fiscal policy, as the government tries to replace shrinking external sources of financing due to increasing international pressure with internal taxation at a time where the country faces serious liquidity problems. This could be a time bomb exacerbating the crisis. Though we have been hopeful to reestablish the national dialogue that was suspended last year, it has not evolved as smoothly as the circumstances demand. The different sectors of society represented in the so-called Civic Alliance claimed that the government shows no political will to solve the main demands of civil society. At the same time, they themselves are facing the mistrust of certain segments of society that rightfully, but unfeasibly, want immediate results. There have been 2 large impasses to the negotiations in less than 2 weeks, and both parties have not even reached an agreement on the themes to be included in the dialogue's agenda. This situation was aggravated this past weekend when a group of peaceful citizens were severely repressed and temporarily detained for exercising their right to protest for the release of imprisoned demonstrators. The fact of the matter is that many see 2 sides of what is happening right now in Nicaragua. One side, some will say, only understands the pressure, while the other demands the release of jailed protesters, transitional justice, and advanced free, fair, and supervised elections, the goals that we in the private sector share. In fact, in his paper, Richard quotes part of a public letter sent to President Ortega by all organizations of the private sector, where for the first time since the protests began in April last year, we urgently requested electoral reforms to provide for advanced and credible elections. I should address the criticism to the private sector dialogue that took place before the protests. In addition to the arguments set forth by Richard and Beatrice's paper that such dialogue was basically the response to a series of public and institutional failures caused by the pacts of corrupt political parties that started long before Ortega returned to power and that in many respects facilitated his return, as Julie has described, some people forget or are too young to remember that it was not long ago that Nicaragua had essentially a Marxist economy that had to be rebuilt. The restoration of private property and a market economy and all the benefits that flowed from that was critically important for all Nicaraguans, as we see in the indicators that Richard presented. This was done through the facilitation of the democratic government of Violeta Barrios de Chamorro and the decisive participation of private capital in the early 90s. And it is private capital that will be the lever for change in the future, in an environment where democracy can flourish again for all Nicaraguans. The business community has taken real risks. We are in this for the long haul. All Nicaraguans want the same things. The question is how that gets defined. Yesterday, the Civic Alliance stated that it will continue to advocate for a peaceful dialogue as the only solution to the current situation. But it also said that the government is the one that has to show political will and good faith to foster the appropriate environment for the negotiations to be successful. Because it actually is the party in the position of power. The business community supports the Civic Alliance view on this. We don't see as an option for history to repeat itself in the form of a conflict that will claim the lives of thousands of Nicaraguans and that will leave the economy in an ill position to face the challenges of restoring growth and employment. The private sector has played an important role in achieving changes we all want for our country. As I said, we asked for advanced elections since May of last year before any other actor had put that option on the table. This is real for us, and it presents real risks for us. What is happening now matters to me, matters to us, and matters to all Nicaraguans. Nicaragua is going to need everyone pulling in the same direction. If we are able to undertake the reforms necessary to restore democracy, but it is not accompanied by prosperity, we will have put at risk the very reforms that led to it. This is so true, as Richard so eloquently has put it in his paper, that prosperity without the proper democratic institutions have proved to be unsustainable. Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to open up for questions here in a minute. I don't know if, Richard, you were furiously taking notes. I don't know if you wanted to make any comments here before we open it up again. I had a couple questions myself.
No, I very much appreciate the comments. Thank you all very much, and I think I'm happy to have questions from the audience.
Great. We have microphones in the audience that will please wait for those to be brought to you. There's people online watching. This will be hosted on YouTube, so we want to be able to hear the questions. We have a question here from Diana Negroponte.
Thank you very much. Richard, thank you for your paper. Diana Negroponte from the Woodrow Wilson Center. Nicaragua had a reputation for stability during the years when the Northern Triangle was and remains racked by gang violence. The police were well trained, community policing was well established. So where are those police now?
Okay, we'll take a couple other questions. Yeah, we got a couple here. Why don't you take the first row, Jose, if you would identify yourself.
Thank you. Thank you, Eric. Jose Cardenas, a consultant here in Washington. I wanted to ask Julie, you mentioned the various levers that the United States has as leverage. One of the things I wanted to ask you, has the administration been looking at Nicaragua's participation in CAFTA? Is there, whether there's any clause or language in there that would allow Nicaragua's suspension, and is the administration contemplating such an action?
And David, yeah.
Thank you. David Lewis, Manchester Trade. Thank you, Richard. Excellent piece. Sort of hard-pressed. There's a sense here throughout the paper that we're talking about rational actors with power sort of sitting down on equal terms. And anybody who's had experience in Nicaragua, short or long, left or lived there like some of us, I mean, there's just one constant in the whole political life of Daniel Ortega, which is, you know, it's just control of power and not rational discussion of what do we do about that. So there really wasn't much mention about that in the paper, but I know you've got extensive experience dealing with Nicaraguan strong men. So I'm wondering if you could just shed some light on your sense of, you know, where you see Ortega and Murillo in this, in terms of leading to that sort of rational prosperity outcome, which is what we all desire, but sometimes it's not what we get in life.
Good. Richard, do you want to take a stab at it? We'll go.
Sure. Thanks very much. Yeah, great questions. So Diana, yeah, so Nicaragua, if you try to explain how come Nicaragua, again, up until very recently, relatively low levels of crime, which is why Nicaragua was favored by foreign investors, by the IFIs, by tourism, compared to the northern tier. We didn't have the outpouring of migrants. You don't see a lot of Nicaraguans in these migrant caravans, for example. Why was that? And the answer to that is partly that the quality of the police. It's difficult, I think, sometimes for us as Americans to accept the fact that the Sandinista revolution reached its logical conclusion with the destruction of the National Guard. And that enabled a complete revamping from top to bottom of the security apparatus. That thoroughgoing reform did not occur in the northern tier. And the northern tier security apparatus, hence, despite some purges, have remained a serious problem, acting often in cahoots with the very criminals that they are supposed to be protecting society against. So in Nicaragua, complete revamping of the security apparatus, and they have been much less corrupt and more in touch with the people, and that's included community policing, as you mentioned, so that when you have young men hanging around the barrios without much to do, smoking marijuana, instead of beating them up or throwing them in jail, as might have happened elsewhere, which would just throw them into the realm of gangs. In Nicaragua, the police tried to say, hey, muchacho, come over here. Let's think about what we can do. How about joining a soccer team? Let's go talk to your mom about your behavior, and let's see what she thinks, and let's see if we can't get you back on track. So there was a much more humane, preventative approach in Nicaragua to criminal activity, particularly among young people. And that was pretty successful. So what happened to what looked like a fairly well-functioning police apparatus? And I think the answer to that is the politicization of the officer corps under Ortega. He has been in power, after all, for 10 years, and he took that time to revamp the officer corps and put in his cronies. So when a crunch came, they stuck with him rather than stick with the rule of law. And so I think that's the story there. David, I love your question. David was referring to my experience with strongmen in Nicaragua when I was a very young guy, a lot younger than Julie even, and I was on the policy planning staff of the State Department. It was my responsibility. The State Department sent me down also to Nicaragua, to Managua, to deliver the message to Somoza, to Tacho Somoza, saying the State Department had lost confidence in his ability to maintain stability and prosperity in Nicaragua, and we thought that he should be thinking of an exit strategy. that was well before the denouement. There was still plenty of time to put Nicaragua back together again without the calamity of '79 and the 1980s. Somoza, however, chose not to listen. He misjudged the relative balance of power in Nicaragua. He was absolutely confident that he could crush the insurrection. And so he just held on Samson-like until the whole edifice collapsed around him. So will history repeat itself? And as Luis underscored, in so many ways, we seem to be repeating the same tragic cycle in Nicaragua. Can Nicaragua break out of that? Of course, the big question in all of this is exactly how will Ortega Murillo react in the dialogue? And this, of course, is the big interrogante. I will say that I think if you analyze the history of Daniel Ortega, yes, he certainly likes, enjoys, maybe even requires being in power. He has, in critical moments, acted, I would say, rationally, in the sense that recognizing the relative balance of power in the country, how much strength he had vis-a-vis other contending forces. He, after all, did negotiate in '88 and '89 an election internationally supervised. He lost that election, to his surprise, but at that time, he did agree rationally to step aside. So we do have, in his own history, examples of rational behavior. He was younger then. He's been in power a long time. That being in power can change people. That may have happened. And then, of course, there's this factor of Rosario Murillo. And people who meet with her come away with the sense that she may be, quote, less rational in the sense of maybe less willing to recognize the relative balance of forces and more a stronger, fierce desire to stay in power at all costs. So what influence she may have going forward remains to be seen. But my last comment on this would be, I think there's been a history in Nicaragua of the contending forces not seeing clearly the actual balance of forces and not weighing correctly what the real options are. And I think we just have to hope that that doesn't repeat itself.
Julie?
On trade agreements, the administration has been very clear. They've been reviewing all trade agreements across the board, making sure they're fair and reciprocal in every aspect. Specifically on CAFTA, I have nothing I can announce today publicly, but that's something that is generally a policy of the administration. That's something we look at all the trade agreements. On the issue of irrational or rational actors, I really love, I go back to this chart in your presentation, the downward economic spiral here. That is the question, whether you're rational or irrational. When the economy starts to do this, you've got to pay attention, and you can't ignore the calls for the people on the streets and as you continue to imprison them. So this will get the attention of the government, we hope, and that will cause a change in behavior, and whether you're irrational or irrational to begin with.
Luis, did you have any comments?
No.
Okay, thank you. You know, I wanted to just add one thing here to Diana's question, and it was also a question I had for you. So we've been engaged here over the last few years on a study of homicides at the municipal level in Central America. Very interesting, detailed look at homicides at that local level. And we've looked at all the countries except Nicaragua, because there's no data, there's no official data about homicides at the local level. So sometimes one point is I think that they get a pass where they probably shouldn't. It's good, as you say, in some ways, but maybe not as wonderful as the PR is. But then my question to you also as I was reading this is, the source of the data for this, do you have a sense that there is good, solid economic data that this is based on? I mean, is this
Are you
something
suggesting
reliable?
I made all this up? What are you suggesting?
Well, I guess I'm not suggesting you made it up, but how reliable is it? I mean, is this something that's because it comes up all the time? I mean,
right.
I mean, Argentina didn't have reliable data for a long time.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you raised that point. And we do have a box raising some questions about the international financial institutions, who certainly did a lot of good in Nicaragua at helping to improve the quality of roads, accessibility to power, improving health and welfare, all of that. But also made some mistakes. And we point out that the IFIs, and one can understand they are, after all, governmental institutions, intergovernmental institutions. Nicaragua itself sits, of course, on the boards of all these institutions. But the tendency not to see clearly enough how the erosion of the political system and the increasing corruption at the senior levels and the lack of transparency, particularly with regard to inflows from Venezuela, all of that, were creating problems that would eventually come home to roost. So we criticize, and also we criticize this issue of the numbers. The IFIs, although they themselves in many footnotes say, well, the quality of some of this data is open to question. Nevertheless, they rely on that data. And by repeating and using that data, they give it additional credibility. And so I think that is a problem. Luis might want to comment on the quality of data. I think in general, people feel that some of the financial data, the fiscal data, not bad in Nicaragua. When it comes to social indicators, some of the social indicators, particularly in recent years, however, there are people, some of whom testified before the U.S. Congress, actually, raising questions about the quality of data in recent years. On the issue of crime, I know, social scientists don't like anecdotal evidence, but I say, when I travel around Nicaragua, all over the country, I feel really quite safe, up until recently, of course. So I'll just put that on the table. I would be much more cautious traveling around much of Guatemala and El Salvador, for example.
Not that we're going to get into an argument here, but perceptions of violence often are radically different than the reality. But anyway, that's another topic. Luis.
Yes. Okay, so I would say that there are always deficiencies in data in developing countries, right? I mean, I was at the central bank in 1994 and back in 1999. And I was in the government of Bolaños in 2002 and worked with data from the central bank and worked closely with the IMF and the World Bank at that time on technical grounds, negotiating programs and so on. And I should say that there's been an enormous effort over the years with the help of the IMF to improve macroeconomic data. And there's been since 1990, a lot of help from the World Bank, also implementing some of the they're helping the country to be able to get good data, macroeconomic data from household data, and these household surveys are done every 4 or 5 years. With the help of with the technical help of the World Bank, there's a lot of comments on whether the government is actually revealing. Well, there's definitely a problem of transparency with the data. So since the crisis began, the data has been restricted. If information on international reserves were published daily, it started to be published monthly or weekly or monthly, and then as not to reveal the day-to-day movements of certain critical variables. So there's been some criticism on that. The private sector, we've been trying to curb this, or at least to have some counterbalance at FUNIDES, which is a think tank. They also have a data bank and try to compare their projections with the government. In several occasions, those projections tend to be worse than what the government says, and it turns out to coincide at the end of the year or the end of the period analyzed that happened. And also COSEP and FUNIDES recently put into place a survey that they do with all the companies that are affiliated to both of them to compare employment data to the government data, especially formal employment and other sources of employment. And definitely, while the public data says that there are about 140,000 people, 180,000 people lost their employment, according to the data from the companies that are firing or hiring and are giving these data to Funidas and COSEP, the amount of people losing their jobs is much larger. Now, what you have to correct that, because the data from Funidas and COSEP includes non-formal jobs that are also lost, right? But even correcting from that, from those issues, there's still a difference, substantial difference. So I think there's criticism about the about manipulation of data, maybe much more recently in the last year and a half or so. But it's hard to say from the private sector whether that is happening or not. In certain respects, like in the banking system or the financial system, that's data that is produced by us, and we provide that to the superintendency and the central bank. So it's really hard to manipulate, right? I mean, because it's these regulated institutions that have to have data on a daily basis and report it. But then there's certain areas in cross-checking the data at the macro level that there are quite substantial differences, and we have put that to the attention to the IMF at some point, and to the authorities also, and I believe there's been attempts to improve on that. But I don't know if it's really hard to say, right? I mean, the only thing you can do is try to project your own data and then see if how far that is from government data.
I don't mean to make the data question the central issue when there's so many other important things going on. But what I kind of hear between the lines is things are bad and they could actually be worse than we know because of all these other ways in which information is not available, there's lack of transparency, obfuscated. So
I think we can all agree, however, on the basic direction of the economy right now.
Right.
The economy contracted last year and continues to contract. And as Julie underscored, it's important for all of the actors in this drama to recognize that if there isn't a political solution, the economy will continue on its downward spiral.
Right. That's the big point. Okay, Cindy's here. We got a couple other questions over there.
Sure.
Go ahead.
Cindy Arntzen, Latin American Program. A number of you in your comments have referred to the issue of corruption. And my question is if any of you can provide some concrete evidence of economic corruption, not just the corruption of political power, which serves, unfortunately, as a powerful disincentive to leave government because it's simply, access to illegal rent. So, maybe Julie, you could talk about why individuals have been sanctioned for corruption. Richard, Luis, any other cases?
Okay, there were a couple questions over here. Kata, why don't you grab those two gentlemen right there, and then I'll come back to you.
I'm Gregory Holliday from the State Department's Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration. Thank you to the Wilson Center and to the panel for convening us here today. We have seen an uptick in migration out of Nicaragua, primarily into Costa Rica. That migration has, I think, primarily been as a result of the economy. We see a lot of circular migration, Nicaraguans going in, working for a period of time, and then returning to Nicaragua. My question is, do we have the makings here of a migration crisis? And if so, what would be the triggers, and what are the early warning signs that we should be looking for? Thank you.
Yes, good morning. Martin Friedel from the Center for International Private Enterprise. Thanks for the presentation, for a great report. I had a question for Mr. Rivas, and understand your position, the private sector's position about, sort of averting sort of a crisis or a contraction of the economy like you saw in the 80s. And maybe you can comment a little bit more about your plans as the private sector, in particular big business, going forward, how you balance that act of, not having your businesses basically disappear and important sources of employment for the population, while at the same time sort of holding the government to, backtrack and really move in a path to elections. And basically we're obviously the private sector wants to see the country move. So how you balance that, so to speak?
Great. 3 questions. Want to start, Richard, or Julie, you want to?
Okay. Well, on the general theme of corruption, that is one of the biggest confidence-building or confidence-losing factors of any country, and we see that quite apparent here. And the NICA Act and other, the Global Magnitsky Act and other frameworks of our sanctions are based on targeting these individuals and entities that have evidence for years have corrupted the country, the systems. And as I said, this is, again, not something that happened overnight. It's decades, it's years of this. And so when people talk about sanctions and the effect and impact of that, it's not targeted at the population. It's for those individuals who have corrupted the system and stolen the resources of the Nicaraguan people. So they are very targeted in their nature. Of course, beyond those sanctions, including new loans from the IFIs, that's something also the U.S. has been very clear about. When you can't account for the current resources and money and banking systems that you have, we don't believe you should get a new infusion of money. And one example is the Bancor. Is that a real bank? They don't have ATMs. There's no tellers. There's no transparency in what that banking system has and how it conducts its business. So these are things that we will remain vigilant on and continue to be monitoring and taking concrete actions.
Okay, so I guess the topic of corruption goes hand in hand with the weakness with the weaknesses in institutions, right? I mean, and the accumulation of power by the central government over other branches of government. So you have institutions that may not be doing their job well, like the oversight of procurements, or the ideal sources of capital for a bank, and so on. So I guess that's part of the problem of centralization and erosion of institutions, and if you don't restore those, you're going to have an endemic problem with corruption moving forward. Regarding the private sector question, there's always this criticism that the private sector is only worried about restoring the economy, and our concern about this to be solved in order to resume business normality, right? I think that we definitely have come to the conclusion that the economic situation is not going to be solved if there's no political solution. What we are trying to do, I mean, there's also criticism about prearranged negotiations in these, which they're not. And what we're trying to do is to facilitate and to support the alliance, the civic alliance, in order to reach these negotiations, in order to ideally will be to reach those negotiations in order for the economy not to fall back 40 years like it did many years, 30 years ago. And I always tell, and I told this Richard once we were talking, Violeta Barrios de Chamorro took power in 1990, but the economy did not grow in 4 to 5 years. It resumed growth until 1996 or 1997. She opened this window for democratic institutions, but then voters were asking themselves, do we want this, right? I mean, it's not creating jobs. It's not solving our problems. And we don't want to be in that problem if the political solution comes and the economy has collapsed to an extent that you cannot provide prosperity, you cannot re-engaged in business and create jobs. So it's definitely there's a consensus among the different civil society actors, including the private sector, that the solution is a political solution. Without it, it's really hard to reverse the trends in economic variables that we are seeing. As I said at my remarks, the trends are continue during these 3 months that are to the ones that are explained in the paper, and they can get even worse. For example, the agricultural sector that Richard explained is so important for the economy, including and it touches agriculture and manufacturing, because there's a lot of agro-industry in the country. Might suffer a lot if by the end of the month there's no clear horizon on the negotiations, because by April 1st, private banks have to decide whether they finance the agricultural cycle. We, last year, the crisis began in mid-April. Banks reacted by reducing credit growth in order to increase liquidity to face the uncertainties, but we were able to finance the agricultural cycle. This year, I would say with a large probability we will not because we don't want to. I mean, the most that we want is to lend. That's how we get our money, right? But because we face more uncertainty towards the future in a more illiquid or less liquid environment, and that's a big issue. I mean, that could change a couple of points in growth, moving forward, than the worst projections show.
So 2 very important questions on the table. One, the immigration issue. Let me point out that in general in Latin America, with something like 2.5 million Venezuelans who are now living mostly in other Latin American countries. Colombia has absorbed, about 1 million Venezuelans? That would be, with a population of 30 million, that would be as though we in the United States suddenly had received 10 million migrants in the period of a year or two. I think this is actually the way Latin America has opened itself to the Venezuelan migrants is a dramatic and inspiring story, actually, of a sense of humanity and empathy on the part of Latin America for the Venezuelan diaspora. In the case of Nicaragua, of course, there's a long history of many Nicaraguans working seasonally in Costa Rica, as you pointed out. The Costa Ricans, despite some tensions, have also, I think, demonstrated their humanity, their openness to migrants, particularly political migrants. And the Costa Rica also is to be congratulated for that human response. Hopefully the crisis draws to a close in Nicaragua. What we have been seeing, of course, is that the educated, particularly younger middle-class people, will leave under these circumstances if they don't see opportunities for themselves, as happened, as you pointed out, Luis, in the early 1980s. And we just hope and have to hope that that cycle does not repeat itself. On the very tough issue of corruption, I'm reminded that at the first Summit of the Americas in 1994, if you read the declaration that all the countries agreed to, they said corruption is a big issue, it threatens the integrity and the credibility of our democracies, and that we have to attack this issue. And shortly thereafter, the OAS passed the Inter-American Anti-Corruption Convention, which was a huge advance. As so often is the case in Latin America, they get it right on paper, but then, unfortunately, they don't move ahead towards full implementation. Imagine how different Latin America would be today if that anti-corruption convention had, in fact, been implemented and taken seriously. A lot of the large-scale corruption that we see in Nicaragua and in other countries in the region had to do with the commodity cycle. When prices were really, really high, there was more money than ever, unfortunately, for people to misuse. And the flows from Venezuela added to that. So as you saw from the graph, suddenly you had $500 million a year, much of it not transparent, not readily accountable for, flowing into Nicaragua. And that really created conditions for a large-scale misuse of funds. How to tackle the issue of corruption? It's a tough one. We have to, ladies and gentlemen, be living in Washington today. We need to be a little humble about this issue of misuse and funds and misusing the authorities, particularly in an executive branch. How to tackle the issue of these tough issues of the misuse of public funds for private purposes. I am hopeful, actually, that technology will be part of the answer. That the combination of internet capabilities, AI, will enable us to ferret out funds with greater transparency and exactitude and timeliness than we have in the past. So as a technological optimist here, I do see the possibility of, after all, corruption, of course, is deeply, deeply ingrained in many of our societies, particularly those that have a tradition dating back to the Spanish crown, which was all about the misuse of public funds for private purposes. But I think in addition to the activities of the non-governmental sector, NGOs, all the reports that we see coming out, shining the light on misuse of public funds for private purposes, I do think technology going forward can be a help. In that regard, the IFIs, if you read the previous IMF reports, they did note that the Venezuelan money coming in was not properly accounted for. And they raised those issues. But over time, I think they said, well, we have a choice here. The government doesn't seem to want to make the necessary corrections. We can stop our flows, or we can just sort of settle for marginal improvements. And perhaps not surprisingly, the IFI said, well, okay, more important for us to be here than not. So I think going forward, the international community does have to think more carefully about how it uses its potential levers to deal with the issue of corruption at the national level. Thank you.
Yeah, and just to make a comment on that,
sure.
It's that's a very relevant point. Nicaragua, it's been under IMF program since 1990. There was a standby program in 1991. There was a GRPF program in 1994, and from that on, maybe a couple of years in 2001, there was not a program because they violated, under the Alemán government, a lot of the targets on the macroeconomic variables. But the structural reform agenda that was placed into those programs all throughout until 2007, 2008 was very ambitious. I mean, part of that was because the country was a candidate to a highly indebted poor countries initiative debt relief. And there were a lot of reforms in the education and health and macroeconomics, finance. And I think that, and this is a constructive criticism, I think international financial institutions that were financing the country from 2007 onwards, the structural agenda was very, very small. I mean, there are no major structural reforms requested or conditioned in the programs by the World Bank, by the IMF, by IDB in the last 10 years. And I think that moving forward, I mean, we're going to need the help of the IMF and so on. I think the structural agenda is something that we have to pick up again. I think you mentioned that in the paper at some point.
Okay, I think we have time for one more round of questions. The young man up here, I think, had a question, right? Why don't you wait for the mic from Cata?
Sí, buenos días. En español, voy a preguntarles. Lester Alemán, miembro de la Alianza. La consulta era de que Nicaragua enfrenta una crisis política que ha desencadenado una crisis histórica, una crisis política que desencadena una crisis económica y una crisis sobre todo también en la juventud. La presión nacional siempre se ha tenido, aún en el diálogo nacional, siempre se ha tenido tres ejes: la presión nacional, la presión internacional y el proceso de negociación. En la presión nacional teníamos lo que eran las marchas o los procesos de descontento social de la lucha cívica. Pero también se añadió el deterioro económico. A raíz de noviembre comenzó a desaparecer lo que eran las marchas porque aumenta el asedio y la militarización en la capital y en los departamentos. Pero la pregunta recae en esto. Personalmente no me gusta comparar el conflicto de Venezuela con nuestro conflicto. Porque al igual que, son dos luchas paralelas, un mismo mal, dos dictadores que se aferran a algo efímero, pero su desarrollo ha sido distinto. En Nicaragua también ha sido distinto. La pregunta es también porque Daniel Ortega creo que es el único que ve hacia el espejo de Venezuela. Al ver la presión hacia Venezuela, puede, en cierta medida, nosotros lo pensamos que fue el replantearse el segundo proceso de negociación o el segundo diálogo. La pregunta es para Julie y Richard. ¿Cómo ven también, o Luis, cómo ven el proceso del tiempo y la valoración del tiempo y continuidad de la lucha en la presión contra Venezuela y el reflector, en este caso, que es Daniel Ortega en Nicaragua?
I can translate very briefly. I mean, I think the question is, to what extent is the experience in Venezuela related to or maybe reflected in? I think you were suggesting, ¿entiendes inglés? Yeah, I think you were suggesting that Daniel Ortega is the one that actually looks to the experience in Venezuela as an indicator. And so to what extent we can look at that comparison to that experience in Venezuela with the experience now in Nicaragua in an effort to change the government and bring about reform. So I don't know if that does justice to it, but so good question. Let's see, there's a question in the back, and I'll take one more after that.
Hi, good morning. Russell Porter from USAID. To me, I think it's taken, that it was remarkable it took 90 minutes to make the parallel with Venezuela. But, but yes, I think the similarities are striking. But I guess my question is really about the current negotiations with the government and whether or not they truly can resolve this without civil society being a full participant of the negotiation process.
Okay. And we have any others? Yeah, one right here. And then I'm going to let you speak, too. But go ahead.
I'm Greg Huger from the Peace Corps. Do you believe that economic collapse can bring down the Ortega Murillo regime? What options do they have to avoid that without offering a political solution? And how long do you think it'll take to sort this out? Thank you.
Great question. And then I want to let Mario De Esa from the IMF to ask a question, make a comment, whatever you'd like, since the IFEs have come up numerous times. So,
hello. Well, thank you, Eric. So I wanted to make a question.
Sure.
If useful, let me just provide some background on the economic indicators.
Yes.
I mean, as Luis said, to be sure, they can be improved in all countries all the time, no?
Yeah.
But if you look, say, physical indicators, the number of employees in the free trade zones, the number of tons of coffee exported, the number of automobiles imported, it's clear there was progress. I mean, you can argue more or less, or in the margin, how fast. But see, I think the economic indicators are reasonably good to have a broad idea. No, they can be improved, and they're improving, and we work with them to improve them. No, so but I think we can trust them, to have this view of what Richard conveyed in his very good paper. No, see, my question is the following. See. Julie spoke about international collaborative effort. And there was this resolution in the European Parliament last week, no, and some parliamentarian, Ana Gomez, issued a list of further sanctions. No, is the U.S. going to support or broaden this effort? No. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Well, 4 questions this time, but you want to start?
Okay. So, Lester Alemán, thank you very much for being with us on this issue of the linkage with Venezuela. First of all, as the Gress pointed out, the largesse from Venezuela, which was very, very important at the height of the flows, has declined to almost zero. So that's no longer an issue. Unlike Cuba, for example, which continues to depend significantly on financial and oil flows from Venezuela. So I would think, if I were sitting in Daniel Ortega's seat, I would, and looking at Venezuela, I would think, well, one, how much resolve does the international community really have here in Venezuela, and therefore in Nicaragua? So that's one thing I would be looking at very closely. The second thing I would be looking at is we have to understand these are negotiations. You have to persuade the people who have the guns that they should step aside. Why should they do that? What's the gain-loss from their perspective? If you are telling them you need to give up the guns that you have and we don't, and we're going to put you in jail, and we're going to take away all your assets, what is the calculation that people still in power are likely to make? So I think if I'm Daniel Ortega, I'm looking at how is the international community going, what sort of exit strategy, what sort of off-ramp is the international community going to offer to people in the Venezuelan regime as an indicator of how I might be treated going forward. So that's my response to the link between Venezuela and how Daniel Ortega might see things from his perspective. I think the point about Daniel Ortega and the economy, he's quite isolated these days. He hangs out in the El Carmen. He doesn't move around very much. So exactly what is in his mind and what is Rosario's mind, of course, remain the big uncertainties. People do say that certainly some of his advisors and perhaps he himself do have understanding, are aware of the economy collapsing around them. That one hopeful aspect of this is that many of the people around Ortega, including his own family, of course, have important economic assets in the country that are themselves at risk as a result of the economic implosion. So the extent to which being rational, David, includes concern with economic assets, that they would be worried about not only their own political but their economic future. And that therefore, in light of the continued economic implosion of the economy, that would increase the pressures on them to come to a political solution which is the only way to halt the continued economic decline.
Sure. Julie?
Okay, so on Venezuela, as you illustrated, there are two distinct countries, different histories, different backgrounds. They both have authoritarian rulers who are oppressing the people. That is true. And it's an interesting point. The day I was in Nicaragua, it was the day that the news came out of Venezuela that Guaido would be the interim president. So that was the exact day that I met with President Ortega. And they can't avoid what's happening in the region, the commonalities, the common themes, the cry of the people, whether it's in Venezuela or Nicaragua or Cuba, that people have said enough. And we want democracy, we want freedom. And now, even more than ever, it's not just a regional issue, as we've seen. In the past, maybe in decades ago, people would see it as a compartmentalized, regionalized issue. Now, this is global. In Venezuela, 54 countries have recognized Juan Guaido as the interim president. And I think our efforts, continued efforts in the diplomatic sphere, working with our allies, working within the OAS, working with the entire international community to continue to put those pressures and call for the free and fair elections in Nicaragua will continue, and based on the calls of the Nicaraguan people. So we are committed to doing that more than ever, I think, and we're seeing these themes emerge throughout the region. On the European Parliament, yes, I heard that news. I don't think they've actually implemented any sanctions yet, but there was an intent to. And again, this shows the international community is well aware, is willing to take action. The more countries are coalescing around the freedoms and democratic cause that are being made by the Nicaraguan people. So we certainly welcome that. And we will continue to use every economic and diplomatic tool available to us to further any kinds of sanctions and other tools that we can use to echo those messages. But we certainly welcome that from the European Parliament. And finally, as the dialogue continues in Nicaragua, the important thing here is for us to really continue to support the civic alliance, the civil society. Every stakeholder has to have a say. And it's going to be challenging. It's not an easy negotiation. But the United States really stands by the process and really urge that every stakeholder be at that discussion, and to a point that the Ortegas cannot ignore the calls of its own people.
Luis, any final words?
Yes. Well, I don't know if I understood the question well. Someone said about how can the current negotiations be successful if civil society is not fully participating, I think. I don't know very well the dynamics within the Civic Alliance, or the dynamics between the Civic Alliance and the UNAB, which is the other civil society organizations conglomerate, or where they all are together. But I do see that the basic structure of the people that are negotiating, it's the same alliance that was negotiating before, except that the negotiating people at the table are less in number. They do have a bunch of people in the next room where they consult and deliberate with people that are from different organizations and civil society. So I think we have members of the Civic Alliance. They me pueden corregir si estoy equivocado. They can correct me if I'm wrong. But I think that the basic structure of the alliance remains intact to a certain extent. I think that the great loss in the negotiations is that the church is not being a witness and accompanying the process, right? I mean, due to, in a country where there are no institutions, then the church, it's the cornerstone of legitimacy in the country. So I think, although they've said they're not going to be there, but they have offered that they're accompany the process from outside. But I think that's a great loss in this round. But I think that the civil society is participating. You have people even from political parties there sitting down at the table. Well, the economic collapse, that's a very good question. I mean, it would be nice to have like the crystal ball, right, on that. I think we cannot underestimate how a country can get deteriorated under such circumstances as the one we face. And we can only go back 30, 40 years ago, in which we had a deteriorating economy very fast, with hyperinflation above 30%, with shortages of goods, rationing of gasoline and electricity during the day for years. I mean, this was, what, I don't know, 5 to 6 to 7 years. So I think that we cannot underestimate the possibility of if this dialogue does not achieve, it doesn't have an achievement in that could be a scenario. I mean, I don't know how it's a possible, I don't know how probable it will be, because there's now a lot of attention of the international community, a lot of involvement, as Julie has explained, that whether that will be a high probability scenario, but it's possible. So regarding the question that Lester asked, I tend to say that to my colleagues in the banking system and in the business sector that we could be a Venezuela in a fast forward, you know, because we don't have the resources that Venezuela had in the last in all this time. We don't have oil, and we don't have sources of foreign exchange that could. So what took Venezuela 5 years to deteriorate, it can take 5 months for Nicaragua to deteriorate. That's how it could be. That's another scenario. So how fast, you know, could be, if things continue like that, there could be a crisis, a very deep crisis, worse crisis than we had economically speaking. And I think that's an important tenet in this negotiation.
All right, thank you much. Just a little parting thought here. Again, on this question of Venezuela, I agree. I think it would be wrong to make sort of a one-to-one comparison with Venezuela. But one lesson I hope can be drawn as Daniel looks at what goes on in Venezuela is that you can cling to power and lose your country in the process, with 2.5 million Venezuelans, people starving, dying for lack of medicines. And so I think at the end of the day, that should be also the message, not to compare the two necessarily, but you can cling to power and lose your country in the process. And I would hope, maybe they're not as rational as we'd like them to be, but I would hope that at some level, he's enough of a Nicaraguan to want to save his country as well. So thank you again. Congratulations, Richard and Beatriz. Thank you, Julie, and the work of the State Department. Luis, gracias. Thank you to Cindy and our AV people. They did a great job of producing this show, so I think you'll be able to see it online and share it broadly. Thank you all very much.
Great.